maybe to start, if you could maybe just fill us in a little bit more from your perspective as exactly sort of how the cuts work, or sort of, the technical side of it all, I guess.
Sure. Well, first of all, this is a grant program.
Okay.
And so minor capital grants are there to fund things like emergency repairs, replacing or relocating, maybe we need to make small adjustments to the facility. So as the term implies, minor capital changes. And over the past number of years, that budget every year has been about $1 million. Last year it was $1.1 million. So as a result of what we're all dealing with in terms of budget pressures, this year's number has gone down to $500,000. So we have a choice to make. We could either keep the grants at the same amount, which was $5,000 per, but then we would be funding fewer organizations, right, fewer applications. Or we could reduce the maximum amount of the grant, and that way we would still be able to meet the needs of most applicants. They simply wouldn't get as much as they had asked for, but they would all get something. So that was the difficult decision we were faced with.
Okay.
And I feel that was the better approach of the two.
Yeah, I guess, so if you're already in that situation, that sounds like a good approach to go. So
It's difficult. No question. And we're trying as much as possible to do two things. Number one, focus our resources on frontline services so that they are not reduced. And second of all, when we do have difficult decisions to make, to try as much as possible to spread that out so that it's not impacting one organization or one service in an out-of-the-ordinary way so that they're standing out alone.
Okay, so thinking, sort of going on to the fact that, okay, you guys are get your budget for the year and it's lower, I'm thinking the motivation behind that.
But I should say our budget actually for the whole year is not lower.
Oh, okay.
But we do have challenges in terms of trying to meet all the needs that we have. So in some areas, we've tried to reduce so that we can take that money and put it into frontline services. Right?
Okay, that's interesting.
We actually have a higher budget this year in the ministry, but of course we have increased demands as well. So when we do manage to save money in areas like this, it goes into frontline services and it goes into other areas. We've actually had an increase this year of $8 million over last year.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So that leads nicely into the next question. I was
in terms of the spending that we're going to engage in childcare.
Yeah. So I started thinking. So okay, some money's coming out of this section, not a huge amount, $500K approximately, and then I'm trying to think if where specifically maybe some of that would be going, because I know if I was the one who used to receive that grant and I heard, well, I had $8 million more, but I'm only getting half as much, something would sound a bit funny.
$8 million more since 2001, right? Or, sorry, over last year, right?
Yeah.
And that's for our overall child care funding. So that's everything we do in child care. So you have increased demand in various areas. When it comes to minor capital, though, that was an area where if we're going to direct services or direct funding to frontline services, right, that's an area that, difficult though it is, that's an area where we sacrifice in order to provide greater support for the others. So it's not a matter of the budget shrinking. We have to continue to meet growing demand. Sure,
shift from one area to another area kind of thing. So I'm just thinking maybe for better explanation, when you're saying frontline services, what might that mean to sort of the average person?
Well, for example, the child care subsidy is a very important part of what we do. We provide right now $148 million this year is going to go for subsidies for low and moderate income families, and that helps them with the cost of child care. So that's about 25% more families receiving that this year than received it back in 01-02. So that's been growing. Right now there's about 50,000 children that will be in daycare through a subsidy that's provided by us. And that's a very important program because it helps those who otherwise would not be able to afford childcare. So that's one example.
Sure. So it seems like it's sort of a little bit of a shift in the philosophy a little bit, where more funds will go towards the users as opposed to going towards the facilities.
Well, I don't know if I would say a shift in philosophy. We still believe that we need to support our facilities and support those agencies that are delivering childcare with support like minor capital. But we're trying very hard as we see reductions necessary to place those in areas like capital as opposed to placing them in areas like direct service. So while the program is valuable and we recognize it'll have an impact on these service providers, the decision that I took was believing that the impact, if we were to make reductions to child care subsidies, would be a greater negative impact than if you're reducing the amount they're receiving for minor capital. So it's not, none of these decisions are where you think a program isn't worthwhile. It's that you're having to make comparisons around where the needs are greatest.
Sure, and I'm just sort of thinking as in this, the child care specific little world, you sort of have the two needs for money are the people that need to pay to go to it, and then the people that need to pay to have the facilities to offer it. So it sounds like we're taking...
I want to portray it as a change in philosophy because we certainly haven't changed our belief that it's important to support organizations with assistance for minor capital. It just so happens that we're in a very difficult budget time, and that means that we have to try everywhere to direct as much as we can toward frontline services. That means in some cases such as this, we're going to have to make reductions in other areas. It doesn't mean we wouldn't like to see those programs increased at another time when there was more money, or perhaps handled in a different way, but right now this is what we have to deal with.
But it sounds like, I mean, you're saying a tough budget situation, but it sounds like a pretty good budget situation if you had $8 million more this year than last year, and it sounds like just looking at the numbers that the facilities are getting less. And then
remember, we spend $300 million approximately on child care every year.
Mm-hmm.
So the $8 million is not a large amount. And when you consider that right now that's funding more than 90,000 licensed and funded child care spaces, you start to see that $8 million doesn't provide a lot of increase when you're responding to increasing demand for the services, right?
Okay. I talked to one of our local child care places here just to try to get a feel for what it might work on the ground. And one of their specific concerns that she sort of asked me if I could relay along was, she's saying, for example, they this year actually needed to access the grant because they had some various issues of some flooding incident that happened, and it was approximately 10,000 or so damage that they needed. And then they're saying now they're only going to be able to get, if something like that was to happen next year, they would sort of be out of luck by 3,000 of that money, and then would have to find that somewhere else. And they're thinking in order to cover themselves for that period, they either have to raise rates or try to scramble and find other sources of funding. So they're wondering what you might say to them, or how would the government address that situation when someone gets in that situation that needs that money and might be forced to shut down or raise fees?
Well, I mean, again, these are some of the difficult choices that we're facing and that I recognize many of those agencies are facing. Is how do they deal with planned expenditures they've had for capital when they're not receiving the same amount that they expected? Those are challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, it's when you, even the example you used, the money that would be coming from our grant wouldn't be the entire amount because the maximum that we changed from was 5,000. So it's something where we in MCFD and those in childcare, unfortunately, are not going to escape from the budget pressures that are facing everyone, not just here in BC but around the world, and that means that we've got to find different ways to do things. We've also sometimes, and I don't know this particular circumstance, in some cases, organizations might make the decision to delay some of their capital. It's difficult to say. They have to make those decisions themselves. But again, our priority is to make sure that we're maintaining those budgets for necessary frontline services, and things like child care subsidy are extremely important.
So then I know just what her next sort of thought was that in those situations, it may happen where it's an accident sort of unplanned, and then they don't have the money. They may have to shut down for a while. So in that situation, if there's more money going to the subsidy, well, the child that's subsidized to go to child care can't go if the facility is not open.
There's a distinction here, though. When there are incidents of an emergency nature, right? There are always other ways in which we can talk about assisting an organization with that. When we're talking about the minor capital, we're typically talking about planned expenditures for repairs and improvements. If there was suddenly a fire in a place or another emergency kind of situation, that's not necessarily something that would be handled through minor capital.
Okay.
It might be. I mean, if it was something they didn't have to fix right away, they might make an application, what have you.
Sure.
But certainly for an emergency situation, that's somewhat different. And all ministries have issues like that to face when they have outside agencies, where from time to time there will be emergency situations take place, and then they discuss whether there's any access to any kind of contingency funding to help an organization through that.
Okay.
So it's a little bit worse of a different color if it's an emergency situation.
Sure. So sort of the kind of final question I had was sort of if you had a chance to speak to the daycare operators out there, what would you kind of say to them to explain this, to explain how it all works to them?
Well, I think first and foremost that we're doing our very best in the ministry across all of the ministry, not just in childcare, to ensure that finances are being directed to support frontline services, so we're not seeing any reductions there. And that means that we have difficult decisions to make in other areas. The important thing with respect to the minor capital is that by reducing the amount of the maximum grant, we're still able to provide that grant to a wide range of organizations, wider than if we had kept it at $5,000.